He was just trying to do the right thing, fix a veteran's truck, no charge. But that simple act of kindness got him fired. Now, out of work and behind the wheel of his old rig, Douglas stumbles on a dangerous secret, and when no one listens, he's forced to make an impossible stand. Would you risk everything to stop what others ignore? The Northline freight yard was already buzzing when Douglas Adams parked his dusty red pickup by the maintenance bay. Another scorching morning in Arizona, and the diesel fumes clung to the dry air like sweat on metal. Douglas, 42, tall, broad-shouldered with weathered hands and crow's feet earned from years under the sun, tightened his cap and headed toward the tool cage. He was a quiet man who worked without drawing attention to himself. If a truck limped into the yard coughing and wheezing, Douglas was the man they called. He didn't need manuals. He listened to engines like they were old friends whispering secrets. That morning, though, it wasn't a company truck that got his attention. An old, sun-faded Peterbilt sat idling near the fence line, steam hissing from beneath the hood. The driver stood nearby, motionless, staring at the ground. He was lean, maybe mid-50s, wearing a weathered camo jacket and jeans. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a cigarette, dropping it before he could light it. Douglas walked over without a word. "Problem?" he asked, eyeing the leaky radiator hose. The man looked up. His eyes were distant, hollow. "It's nothing. Just overheated. I'll figure it out." Douglas crouched, already reaching for the latch. "Pop the hood. I've got 10 minutes before my shift starts." The man hesitated, then complied. It didn't take long. New clamp, top off coolant, adjust timing. A $20 fix and 20 more minutes of elbow grease. Douglas didn't ask the man's story, but he saw enough in the stiff posture and tired eyes to guess. PTSD. Maybe more. A man between places. The driver gave his name only once. "Theo." "Truck's good now," Douglas said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Try to stay out of the mountains till you get that fan belt replaced." Theo nodded. "How much do I owe you?" Douglas shook his head. "Call it even." That would have been the end of it. Just a quiet act of decency between strangers. But someone saw. A yard manager with a clipboard. And later that afternoon, Douglas was called into the office. "Adams, you worked on a non-company vehicle during your shift. No invoice. No record. No authorization." Douglas stood tall. He was stranded. "I clocked in late and fixed it off the books." "Doesn't matter. That's liability. What if he sues? What if he drives off and crashes and they say you touched the brakes?" Douglas didn't argue. He just nodded once and set his badge on the desk. He packed his things in silence. Some of the younger mechanics gave him sympathetic looks. A few avoided eye contact. But no one said a word. That's how the industry worked, rules over reason, policy over people. By sunset, Douglas was back in his garage, a squat metal building behind his small home on the edge of town. The fridge hummed louder than usual. A photo of his late wife and their son, now grown and living in Denver, sat crooked on the workbench. That night, as he sipped black coffee from a thermos and stared at the calendar, his phone buzzed. An old friend from a parts distributor owed him a favor. They had a client looking for a one-off delivery. One sealed container, picked up from a depot in Yuma and dropped in eastern New Mexico. No logs. Good money. The friend didn't give many details. Just said the client had insisted on someone independent who didn't ask too many questions. The load was supposed to be surplus equipment headed for disposal, and Douglas's old rig fit the bill. No GPS, no company tag, no need for formalities. It sounded shady, sure, but not criminal. Not at first. Douglas hesitated. He hated mystery jobs, but bills don't pay themselves. And his truck, an old Kenworth with rust-stained mirrors and an oil pan that wept like a bad memory, still had a few miles left. He agreed. By dawn, Douglas had hitched the container to his rig and checked the tires twice. The shipping manifest listed non-perishable mechanical equipment bound for a decommissioned logistics site. The container itself was sealed, but Douglas had seen enough manifests to know when something smelled off. The weight was wrong. The paperwork was vague. And the route, through long-abandoned side highways, not main interstates, made no logistical sense. Still, He drove. The desert stretched out like an endless rug of gold and dust. Saguaro cacti passed like slow sentinels. At a remote gas station near the Arizona border, he stopped for diesel and a bathroom break. As he circled back to check the trailer, something caught his eye. A corner of the rear seal had been tampered with. Not broken, just pressed in, slightly unseated. Douglas slid a gloved hand across it, then hesitated. He looked around. No one in sight. He climbed up and unscrewed the container latch with a multi-tool he kept on his belt. The doors creaked open slightly. Inside, it looked like auto parts, all neatly stacked in crates. But behind the front row of boxes, there was a second layer. Different crates. Cleaner. Marked with faded stenciling. USMC property. Do not redeploy without clearance. His gut twisted. These weren't spare parts. These were surplus weapons. Rifle crates, targeting systems, maybe worse. And this wasn't some forgotten inventory run. Someone had hidden them in civilian cargo, counting on the driver not to notice. He closed the doors quietly and resealed them, heart pounding. Back in the cab, Douglas sat with the engine off, hands gripping the wheel. They picked him for a reason. His truck was too old to track. No company tags. No paperwork trail. No questions asked. They thought he wouldn't look. They were wrong. Douglas drove through the desert with the radio off and the windows cracked, letting in the dry wind and distant hum of tires on faded asphalt. But no breeze could cool the rising heat in his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen inside the container. Those crates, clean and labeled like they'd been stashed deliberately, not forgotten. This wasn't a bureaucratic mix-up. It was a cover-up. By the time he passed Gila Bend, Douglas had made up his mind. He couldn't just deliver the shipment and pretend he hadn't seen anything. He pulled into a truck stop, parked behind the diesel pumps, and dug out a list of old numbers from his glove box. People he hadn't talked to in years. Some were former mechanics, some military vets, one an old customer who'd worked procurement for a defense contractor. The first few calls went nowhere. Wrong numbers. Disconnected. But on the fourth, he got a voice he recognized. Barry, a soft-spoken gearhead who'd once retrofitted military rigs for civilian use. Douglas Adams? Damn. I haven't heard from you since Phoenix burned down that parts yard. What's going on? Douglas didn't waste time. Hypothetically, if a guy saw military-grade crates inside a civilian shipment, marked as mechanical components, would that make sense? There was a pause on the line. Hypothetically? No, not unless someone's hiding something. Douglas asked about the codes on the labels. Barry got quiet again. Those were phased out in the early 90s. Black letter surplus. It was supposed to be destroyed or strictly repurposed. Why do you ask? Douglas exhaled slowly. Let's just say I think I'm moving something I shouldn't be. Barry gave one final warning. If they're still using those codes, it's off the books. And if you saw it, you weren't supposed to. Get out, Douglas. Douglas thanked him and hung up. He called the sheriff's office next, anonymously. He asked if there were any active investigations into defense smuggling operations in the region. The deputy on the line gave a clipped response. That kind of claim needs evidence, sir. And if you're calling from a payphone, it won't go far. But Douglas wasn't using a payphone. He looked up at the corner of the truck stop. SUV sat parked under a tree, windows dark. He hadn't noticed it before, but it hadn't been there long. Trying not to draw attention, Douglas walked back to his cab, started the engine, and pulled out onto the highway. As he checked his mirror, the SUV followed, keeping 2 car lengths back. He took the next exit without signaling, an old gas station half covered in sand, long since abandoned but still standing. As he pulled in, the SUV passed on the highway, never turning, never slowing. Douglas waited. Minutes passed. He tried his phone. No signal. The cell tower was right there, rusted and blinking but operational. And yet no bars. That's when he realized they were jamming the area. He was being watched. Tracked? Probably not. His rig was old, no satellite feed, no company transponder. That's exactly why he'd been chosen. He was disposable. He sat in the cab for a long moment, heart pounding. Then he made a decision. This wasn't about a paycheck anymore. He wouldn't just dump the container in New Mexico and walk away. Someone had to stop this. But how? He studied the old maps stored in his glove compartment. Folded between stained wrappers and half-finished crossword puzzles, he found what he was looking for: a network of rural bridges and decommissioned service roads, most forgotten even by locals. If the convoy used those routes, there'd be only a handful of choke points. One of them, a narrow steel truss bridge over Blackwell Canyon, stood out. Douglas traced the line with a pencil, thinking aloud. One road in, one road out. He circled it. As dusk settled over the desert, he drove west again, this time looking for a place to gather his thoughts. He didn't want to sleep. Couldn't. He needed a neutral ground, a familiar face. 20 miles outside of Kingman, he saw it. Betty's Diner. A squat building with sun-faded signage, leaning slightly but still open. He'd eaten there years ago, back when his son was still little and they'd taken road trips just to watch the sunset from rest stops. Douglas parked and walked in. The bell above the door jingled. Greasy smells and warm chatter filled the room. He stepped inside, eyes scanning the booths, and froze. In the far corner, beneath a dusty Route 66 sign, sat Theo. But this wasn't the man Douglas had helped that morning in the yard. No shaky hands. No 1,000-yard stare. He sat upright, jacket clean and zipped, eyes sharp and focused. He didn't look broken anymore. He looked ready. Douglas approached slowly. Didn't expect to see you again. Theo looked up, and for the first time Douglas saw something almost like amusement flicker in his eyes. Neither did I. But I figured you might find your way here. Douglas slid into the booth across from him. You knew something was wrong with that cargo, didn't you? Theo nodded. I didn't know what load you'd be carrying, but I knew Northline was dirty. Always suspected they were running surplus under the radar. Lately, the movements picked up. Different containers, off-grid routes, no paperwork. Military gear, disappearing. Douglas leaned in, voice low. I opened the back of that container. Someone packed it to look innocent, but I saw what was underneath. Crates with black-letter surplus codes. Stuff that's supposed to be destroyed. Theo exhaled. Yeah, they're repurposing old networks, routes from the Cold War days when no one tracked freight through the desert. Back then, we called it the Ghost Line. No GPS, no records, no questions. Douglas narrowed his eyes. And now they're hiding weapons in it. Theo nodded. The kind that don't officially exist. Douglas sat back, the weight of it settling in his chest. I tried to report it. Sheriff's office brushed me off. Told me I needed evidence. Like I wasn't walking around with a loaded secret already. You weren't supposed to see it, Douglas. That's why they picked you. No transponder, no company rig. You were a blind spot in their system. Douglas looked out the window toward his parked truck. They're going to move more of it. Soon. Theo's expression darkened. They already are. There's only one place they can funnel a convoy like that without hitting a checkpoint. Douglas pulled a folded paper from his pocket and laid it on the table. An old route map, creased and stained. His finger tapped a spot circled in pencil. Blackwell Canyon Bridge. Theo gave a half-smile. Thought you'd figure that out. Douglas didn't respond. He just looked up at him. You planning to be there? Theo's eyes locked onto his. I won't be alone. Douglas didn't ask what that meant. He didn't ask who else was coming, or how far this went. They were past the point of asking. Dawn hadn't yet broken when Douglas Adams turned his rig off Route 160 and onto an old service road that twisted through the hills. The headlights cut through the desert fog, revealing rusted mile markers and the brittle remains of fences long abandoned. Every bump and rattle echoed inside the cab like a countdown. At the summit, the road narrowed. The steel truss bridge loomed ahead, gray beams weathered and scarred, spanning a dry canyon with jagged rock on either side. No cell towers, no power lines, no escape routes. Perfect. Douglas eased his rig into position, crossing the lane sideways just a few feet before the bridge entrance. He let the air brakes sigh, shut off the engine, and slid the key into his jeans pocket. The wind was dry and still. Not even the vultures stirred overhead. Then he waited. First it was just quiet, an occasional breeze, a lizard scurrying across cracked pavement. He sipped coffee from a thermos and watched the empty road wind back down the hill, expecting something to appear. But nothing came, until it did. A lone truck rolled up first, an older freightliner, its driver clearly confused, honking twice and gesturing out the window. Douglas gave a polite wave but didn't move. More trucks followed, then a box van, then a pair of tankers with mismatched license plates. They formed a loose line behind him, engines idling, the drivers stepping out, scratching their heads. "What the hell's going on?" someone called out. "You broke down." Douglas stood on the shoulder, arms folded. "Nope, just waiting." Another man stepped forward. Young, too clean-cut for the job. Black cargo pants, earpiece. He wasn't here to deliver anything. "You need to move this truck," he said flatly. Douglas looked him over. "Got a manifest?" The man didn't answer, just motioned behind him. Two more men approached, armed. No insignia, no name tags. One tapped the butt of his rifle against Douglas's door. "This is your last warning." Douglas didn't flinch. "Call the sheriff. Let him open the containers." Phones came out. Drivers began filming. One muttered, "What the hell is this?" Another whispered, "Is this a raid or something?" The armed men grew tense. They hadn't planned for witnesses. Douglas walked back to the front of his rig and leaned against the grill. "Go ahead. Push it. This truck's not moving unless someone in uniform clears it. Not your patchless goons." One of the smugglers stepped toward him, chest puffed. "We'll tow it ourselves." Douglas stared at him. "Good luck with that." They moved toward the trailer's hitch, then stopped. In the distance, a low rumble echoed through the canyon. Everyone turned. A plume of dust rose beyond the switchbacks. Then came the shapes, at least a dozen vehicles. Pickups, Humvees, a couple of old deuce-and-a-halfs. They rolled like a cavalry charge, engines roaring, dust clouds billowing in their wake. The smugglers stiffened. Douglas didn't move, just smiled. Theo was at the front of the pack, standing in the bed of a tan pickup like a man on a mission. He wasn't alone. Beside him, a woman in fatigues held a phone to her ear. Another man wore the patch of a military police unit, off-duty maybe, but real. More than a dozen veterans followed, some in uniform, others in old denim jackets and service hats. No rifles, just presence. The lead Humvee pulled up and stopped directly behind the convoy. Then everything paused, like the world was holding its breath. Theo stepped down and approached the front of the convoy. Douglas met him halfway. "You weren't bluffing," Douglas muttered. Theo smirked. "You think I wear camo for decoration?" The smugglers were frozen. One made a move toward his radio, but the woman with the MP patch was faster, camera rolling, badge visible. "Any attempt to move those containers without inspection will be treated as obstruction and potential trafficking. We've got it all on film." The drivers behind the smugglers began backing up, slowly, cautiously. No one wanted to be part of whatever was happening. That's when the panic set in. A man near the middle of the convoy, sweating, eyes darting, slammed into his cab and gunned the engine. He tried to force his truck through the side of Douglas's cab over. The sound of metal tearing and glass shattering exploded through the canyon. But Douglas's rig held. The attacking truck slammed to a halt, crumpled like a soda can. The crowd gasped. Cameras zoomed in. Douglas was on the ground, but already getting up, blood on his brow, but steady. He looked at the crumpled wreck, then at the others. "You still want to go through?" he asked. No one answered. The sound of the crash still echoed across the canyon when everything shattered into motion. The smugglers shouted over one another, confusion and panic written all over their faces. One of them reached for his weapon, too fast, too sloppy, and found himself face down in the dirt before he could unclip the holster. A younger veteran, built like a linebacker and wearing a torn Marine hoodie, had moved like lightning. "Stay down," he growled. "We're not here to play." Around the convoy, the arriving veterans fanned out with practiced precision. They didn't brandish weapons. Their calm, controlled movements carried an authority that shouted louder than any gun. Trucks were boxed in. Tires were deflated. Drivers were asked to step out. Most did willingly, hands raised and eyes wide. Douglas stood near the front of his wrecked cab, dazed but upright, a trail of blood tracing down his temple. His truck was holding the line, quite literally. Its bent frame now fused with the nose of the smuggler's rig. The two vehicles locked together like opposing fists frozen mid-strike. Dust swirled around him as a SUV finally crept forward from the convoy's rear. Two of the men who stepped out wore comms gear and moved like former soldiers, but not ones on the right side of this fight. Then came the distant chop of rotor blades. Everyone looked up. A news helicopter emerged over the ridge, circling the scene like a hawk. Its camera aimed downward. Someone had tipped them off. Douglas turned and saw her, the woman with the MP badge from earlier, holding her phone in the air, face emotionless. She gave a subtle nod toward the chopper. "They're live streaming," she said calmly. "Smile." It was over. The smugglers knew it. One by one, they dropped their weapons, stepped away from the containers, and raised their hands. The veterans moved in firmly, detaining without cruelty. It was efficient, controlled. Douglas felt the adrenaline drain from his limbs. He stumbled slightly, and Theo was there beside him in an instant. "You okay?" Theo asked, voice low. Douglas nodded. Still standing. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Real law enforcement this time. The cavalry had finally woken up. Now they showed up. Within the hour, the bridge was a circus. County deputies secured the perimeter. ATF agents arrived next, followed by a small team from the FBI, flown in from Flagstaff. The containers were opened and photographed. The crates inside weren't just weapons, they were unregistered prototypes, missile guidance systems, parts that shouldn't exist outside of high-clearance bunkers. One federal agent, older, wearing no name tag, walked up to Douglas as he sat on the bumper of a veteran's pickup. "You're the guy who blocked the bridge?" the man asked. Douglas nodded. "Guess so." The agent didn't smile, didn't frown. He just extended a hand. "Then you bought us time we didn't know we needed." Douglas shook it, then winced as two deputies approached. "Mr. Adams," one of them said hesitantly, "we have to process you for obstruction." Douglas stood without argument. "Do what you need." But even as they cuffed him, gently, almost apologetically, the crowd of veterans stood with him. One of them recorded everything. The helicopter circled back. Douglas rode to the sheriff's office in silence. But by the time he arrived, the front lawn was already filled with reporters. Someone had leaked the footage. His name was everywhere, trending on social media before sundown. He was released before nightfall. No charges were filed. Back home, Douglas returned to his modest garage. The door creaked open like always. The scent of motor oil and dust welcomed him. He stood there for a long while, staring at the photo of his wife and son. By the next morning, flowers had been left by the gate. A few days later, a group of schoolchildren arrived with hand-drawn signs. "Thank you, Mr. Douglas. You stopped the bad guys." One teacher asked if he could come talk to the class about doing the right thing. Then came the letters. Some from veterans, others from truckers, a few from people he didn't know saying they'd always felt small in the face of injustice, and now maybe they didn't. Job offers came too. Bigger garages, union contracts, even consulting work. He politely declined most. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. One morning, a city official knocked on his door. "We're renaming the street by the elementary school. It'll be called Adams Way. Hope that's all right." Douglas scratched his neck, visibly uncomfortable. "Isn't that a little much?" The man smiled. "Not after what you did." And Theo? Gone. No one could confirm who he was or what branch he'd served in. He didn't appear in official reports. No records. No footage of him past the first few minutes of the live stream. Like a ghost who knew exactly when to vanish. But Douglas didn't need proof. Some people are real even when they leave no trace. Weeks later, the truck sat alone on the edge of the property. The front was still dented, the paint still scratched. Douglas hadn't fixed it. He wasn't sure he would. The sun dipped low over the desert horizon, casting shadows across the dust. The truck stood like a monument, silent, battered, and defiant. Not pretty, not polished, but legendary. This story reminds us that integrity often starts with one quiet act of courage. Douglas didn't plan to be a hero, he just refused to back down. What would you do if no one else was willing to act? Tell us in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please give a like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more powerful stories that stay with you long after the road ends. See you in the next video.